Take it away.
First of all, for all of you that are not members of REPS, you are not allowed out of here until you become members.
Second of all, can we have the house lights back on, please? Thank you.
All right, that's better. Let's see your happy little face.
On my left is a man I have been aware of since my childhood, or my early teen years, because he showed up in a Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan movie doing his best to kill Jane. So for years I've hated him. His career goes back into the 40s with some of the top people of the golden age of radio, the golden age of film. He's worked at Republic, RKO, Warner Brothers, possibly Columbia. He'll tell you more about that. He's appeared in film and television. This man has done more in his life than I could ever hope to do in mine as an entertainer. And he hasn't rested on his laurels. He produced a film that many of you may remember, and I'll let him tell you about that. And he puts together celebrity tennis matches. He can still act, as you saw today. He's generous to reps to a fault. Please welcome Tommy Cook. All right, Tommy, this stock question, how old were you when you started?
I was about 8 years old.
8 years old in Hollywood?
We came out here from Minnesota, my family. My father became quite ill with kidney disease right after I was born. And so for the good weather in California, we came out here. And strangely enough, I have no memory of the first 5 years of my life. When we drove to California, we were in a horrible accident. Nobody was killed, but everybody had stitches all over my face. And the anesthetic in those days was ether. Put a washcloth over you. And anyway, I've been lucky with eidetic imagery ever since, but no memory back in Minnesota. But they tell me that I used to dress up and with costumes and entertain my grandmother, who had little creeping paralysis and Parkinson's, etc. And I used to try to entertain her. And they say that my family were members of a Rotary Club, and I would get up on a table and start dancing and stuff. So when we came to California, my mother thought, maybe I might have some talent. And she took me to audition at the Pasadena Playhouse, very famous playhouse. And I stayed there and I did 7 straight plays. First play, Peter Goes to the Fair, directed by Betty Smith. And I cued all the actors. God gave me that memory. And then my mother saw an article in a magazine for a free, to audition for a free at NBC, a free recording at NBC. So I went there and they recorded my voice. And a week or two later, I got a call to come back to NBC and audition for Arch Oboler in the great days of radio. Arch Oboler, the poet laureate of radio, Norman Corwin and Orson Welles. They were the Steven Spielberg of the radio days. So I got the role because I had the youngest sounding voice. And I had to play a little German boy, and somehow I could play a little German. I could somehow have the accent to do it. And after the show, Arch comes out, thanks everybody. The show starred the great Russian actress Alla Nazimova. And so Arch says, thank you, everybody. I gotta go to Chicago next week. Gotta do a show with this young guy, Dickie Hyland. He's a very good actor. I don't want to go to Chicago. So Alla said, well, Arch, if you don't want to go to Chicago, take a chance on this little kid, Tommy Good. Arch took a chance. The next week I starred on Every Man's Theater, sponsored by Oxidol. And Howard Duff played my father. Mercedes McCambridge was the leading lady. Gordon Jenkins did the music. That was my start in radio. Became part of Arch Oboler's stock company, with the greatest stock company. I know the names don't mean anything to you, but people like Hans Conried and Elliot Lewis and Mercedes McCambridge, and Arch had all the top screen stars that would star in his shows. And I must tell you that in those days, radio was the big medium. There was no television. And radio was as big as films, if not bigger. Millions of people imagining these stories, these comedies, and these dramas. And the best people I ever worked with in all mediums came from radio. And I must tell you that being here in Seattle each year with REPS, and to work with Larry, Jen Oliver, Brian Hendrickson, and all the gang, I feel I'm back at home. I'm back at home at NBC and CBS.
Thank you, Don. Now, it's really too bad you can't remember anything of your early career. Now, you did almost all, you worked for CBS, NBC, and you were on another show that was recorded at NBC, but eventually aired over Mutual.
Yes, at one time I was under contract to all three networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC. I was the original Little Beaver, as you saw maybe some pictures, in the Republic serial, a 12-episode serial in 1940, and with Don Redberry. And then 2 years later, I played Little Beaver in The Adventures of Red Ryder on the old ABC Blue Network. They didn't have studios, so we did it at NBC. At Sunset and Vine, Studio H, right next to Lum and Abner. And Studio A, Burns and Allen. Studio B, Bing Crosby Show down the hall. Studio D, Red Skelton. Not bad, not bad.
Some of your dialogue in Red Ryder is timeless. Do you remember any of the lines?
Well, we always opened the show. Art Gilmore was, great Art Gilmore, who came from Seattle, was the announcer, and the music, and say, out of the West comes America's famous fighting cowboy. And Reed Hadley, who played the original Red Ryder on radio, said, come on, thunder. And then Little Beaver would say, get him up, papoose! That would we do every week.
Tonto and Little Beaver would get together and exchange notes on language.
And then at the same time, I was playing Junior on The Life of Riley with William Bendix. And then I would go down 2 blocks to Sunset and Gower at CBS, and I played Little Alexander on The Blondie Show with Arthur Lake and Penny Singleton. So I was going back and forth and back and forth. But NBC was my second home.
One of the things that some of you may not know is that in radio, this was live. It wasn't taped. So Tommy could do 3 or 4, maybe 5 shows a day going back and forth between studios, sometimes networks. And he shares a story about one actor, Marvin Miller. Remember that story?
Yeah. Marvin Miller was one of the greats in radio. He was an announcer. He starred in shows. He could play the villains. He could do it all. And he had quite an ego and was busy every day and every day. Now the radio business is starting to dwindle a little bit. And we were all around him one day, and he said, I just don't believe it. I'm down to 16 shows a week.
Well, let's touch on something that I don't know if you've talked about before. You did film at the same time you were doing radio.
Yes.
How did you manage that schedule?
Well, I always went to public school. I never wanted to go to professional school. They had Hollywood Professional, Mark Kent. I wanted a normal life. I had wonderful parents. And I would leave school and take 3 different buses to get to NBC. Later on, I hitchhiked. And what was the question?
Try it again.
Yes, try it
You
again.
did movies and television.
Yes.
Not television. Movies and radio.
Yeah.
How did you work for schedule?
Well, they let me off at times, and a man by the name of Frank Brzee would come in and replace me as Little Beaver on the radio. I would do a film and then I would come back. Frank Brzee actually did the pilot for the original Red Ryder radio show. And then when Steve Schlesinger, who put it together and made the deal to go on the air, they brought in a man by the name of Paul Franklin, who wrote most of the episodes and directed the shows. He decided he wanted to audition and bring in a different cast. And so he saw Arch Obler, and he said, "Do you have any ideas? I want to recast for Red Ryder this Little Beaver kid." He said, "Well, Little Beaver, try Tommy Cook." So that's how I got the role. But Frank, who's been my dearest buddy, we go back to LA high school, and then when I got too old, a boy by the name of Johnny McGovern took over for me and played Little Beaver, both on the Mutual Broadcasting System and at NBC, the ABC Blue Network. And later on, he changed his name to John Wilder because somebody else had the name John McGovern in the Screen Actors Guild. And John Wilder went on to become an award-winning, prolific writer, producer, director. We did a television show as actors, and we choreographed a fight scene, and when we shot it, and the cameras were rolling, I missed it, hit him right in the face.
Oh, no.
But he didn't mind, and we've been great buddies ever since. And when he was writing all the Streets of San Francisco shows, he hired me to play the lead villain. So we've had this fabulous relationship. And in the 70s, I created a storyline and marketing concept for a film called Roller Coaster, and I sold it to Universal. And now, I've been working the last couple of years in the follow-up called Roller Coaster Revenge, and guess what? John Wilder has been guiding me with story structure and character development. And so we've continued this wonderful, wonderful relationship. And John, of course, has come up here and has done so many rep shows.
You've come up here for Showcase this last
Yeah,
year.
yeah.
When do you want to start the question?
I'm thinking about now would be good.
Okay.
Before what? They're not breaking. We're going to
We're
take
not
some
breaking.
questions from the audience.
We
Does
took out the license
anybody?
and everything, we're not breaking.
Okay, we've got one over here.
Thank you for being here, Tony. You mentioned earlier a group of people you work with, one of them being Elliot Lewis. Can you share any stories or anecdotes about your work with him or his career?
I consider Elliot Lewis the all-time great radio actor. He was part of Arch Obler's stock company, of course. He starred, Arch wrote for each of his stock company members, and Elliot Lewis starred in so many of the shows. And I must tell you before I continue with Elliot, Arch wrote for me, and I just knew that character. And the words just like they were coming from me, not from him. And he would not let me take a script home to the woodshed. Didn't want anyone. He believed in me. He knew I knew that little kid. And so I didn't rehearse until dress rehearsal. And so how wonderful. But Elliot could play heavies. And on the Jack Benny show, he played comedy characters. And he first married Mary Jane Croft, who was a great radio, then Kathy Lewis, and they were all on Arch's shows. And then Elliot, in his later years, became a producer and writer at CBS. I did a show at The Champions, a live telecast with Rory Calhoun. We did The Champions show. I played Arthur Kennedy role, the crippled brother, and Rory, of course, played Kirk Douglas's part, and Elliot Lewis was one of the producers of the show. So he was just the best.
Another question? Anybody?
Anybody got it? Oh, okay, we got a few more here.
Get the close one. Go ahead.
I've always wanted a Red Ryder BB gun. My mother
yes.
my mother would never let me have one. Now, how about you? Did you ever get a Red Ryder BB gun?
I signed several of them. They have a museum, and Fred Harmon, who was the incredible artist that created Red Ryder and the comic strips, etc., he sent me, I should have brought one of the pictures, but he sent me, he made the caricature Red Ryder and Little Beaver and sent me a very personal note that I'll always treasure. But
You never had one of your own.
I have 3 or 4 BB guns. Oh yes, oh yes. And as a matter of fact, I used one once. I lived on a street, nothing but kids on both sides of the street, 1 block from the main thoroughfare, Olympic Boulevard. This was Olympic Place. And we played football and baseball in the streets, and next door was little Benny Bartosh, and I got mad at him one day, and I pulled out my BB gun, and I boom, hit him right at heard him, but yeah, I have several BB guns.
Thank goodness.
We got another question behind Terry.
Who's got a hand up? Over here?
Did he?
Oh, hold on. Let me bring you a mic there, friend. I'm going to sneak behind. Go for it.
Well, was there a guy that played the part of Lone Ranger?
Pardon me, would you?
What? The BB gun.
Pardon?
He doesn't understand.
Okay.
He doesn't. Sorry.
Do we have another
Oh,
question?
you had one here. The
There was, I saw also a hand right here that was
Yeah,
up.
there you go.
I thank you, that wonderful performance earlier, great vocal performance. Also really appreciate the sound effects, which is always interesting to see how it's done. And speaking about Arch Obler, he was pretty well known for very shocking, violent content at the time in his Lights Out series and others, and I'm just wondering if you have any insight how he managed to get that stuff on the radio, some of which was quite dark and horrific for the time.
Right. I never did Lights Out. That was actually, it was created out of Chicago by somebody else, and then Arch came right along and he made it such a great show. What a mind he had, what a mind. But the shows that I did for Arch, Everyman's Theater on NBC Friday nights, and then Plays for Americans during the Second World War. And I'll always remember, I did one show, and I played a young kid, and his father told him that America's in deep trouble, and everybody has got to try to help and do something. So I go down to the Marine Corps, and I try to get in, and they, get away, sonny boy, get away. And I go to the Air Force, and I go to the Army and the Navy, and nobody will let me in. So now I take off, and I'm in the countryside, and there's Hans Conried, another of the all-time greats. He's a conscientious objector, and he's got this paper, and he starts reading it, and he says, I have no qualms, I'm not against anybody, I don't want to go in, I don't want to go into the Army. And I said, well then, give me your papers, I'll take them, I want to go in. My dad says we're in deep trouble, let me go in. Looks at me and he says, that's all right, kid. I understand. That's all right. And so I woke up and I said, gee whiz, I tried to get into the Marine Corps, I tried to get into the Navy, nobody will have me. Gee whiz. And I cry off and Gordon Jenkins' music comes in, and it was heaven to me. It was great. He really did some nice work during the war effort in his writings.
To answer your question just a little bit, I know a little bit about this. One of the tricks writers would use, and maybe Mr. Ogler did the same thing, he'd have the scene where they rip off both the guy's arms and then open his chest. Well, you can rip off one arm, and you can open a part of his chest. That'll be okay. So they would make it worse than it was, and they would, just to get their 2 cents in. they cut it a little bit, so a lot of the time, that was a trick a writer would use to get some of that stuff in, make it worse.
And then you have horror movies, or used to with horror movies. Too.
Oh, I was thinking the nightly news, but that's okay.
You know, Arch was the first one that had 3D film. He was way ahead of his time. And then he did a play in New York, The Night of the Auk. One of the great Broadway directors directed it. It wasn't much of a hit. And I was just out of the Marine Corps, and I'd gone to New York. I had set up an interview with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio. I spent about a minute and a half with him, and that was it. He had no interest in me. He wanted another Marilyn Monroe. So I went to Sandy Meisner, the neighborhood playhouse, and we got along just great. And so I became a member, but I came back home and got a part in a film called Night Passage at Universal with James Stewart and the great war hero, Audie Murphy. I played his brother in the film. When we were finished shooting, the whole session was over at Sandy Meisner's. What was the point I was trying to make?
We just have a couple more
What was the
questions.
point I was trying to make? What is it?
It's lost now. We have two more.
I actually have a question for Larry Elbert. I was at the REPS Showcase like a handful of years ago when you and Janet Waldo did a true reading about General Lee's letter stories. It was very touching, and I wondered if that's going to be developed for like the radio audience.
Well, it was based on a novella that her late husband, the author Robert E. Lee, wrote, and it was letters between Robert E. Lee and a young New England woman named A.B. Woodhouse, and it's from 1828 to 1870. They only met one time, and it was a back and forth correspondence that had a break during the Civil War, because North-South, she lost a daughter and a husband due to the Civil War. Of course, he lost some family as well. They reconnected in 1865 and almost met again that year, but she saw him, but he didn't see her. It turned out that while Bob Lee used all of Lee's letters, he made up all of Amy's dialogue. And I was fortunate enough to do it with his widow, Janet Waldo. Many of you know her as the voice of Judy Jetson. And you don't know what a fantastic dramatic actress she was. And I did it up here with her, and then I was invited to do it in the Los Angeles area, and I went down. Sadly, Janet passed away a few months ago, and the daughter, Lucy, is in the throes of, this is a huge estate, and doing with the house and everything. So right now, the lost letters are all Robert E. Lee, while not lost, has in the course of time been misplaced for a little while.
Robert E. Lee and Jerry Lawrence, who of course wrote Inherent the Wind, they started writing radio scripts. I did a couple of shows for Robert E. Lee, I remember, and once I had to wear a Boy Scouts uniform, and we shot it somewhere down in Vermont. It wasn't at NBC, but, and then with Janet, I did so many shows with her. She was one of the greats. And of course, Corliss Archer, you're familiar with the Corliss Archer show. And when I got out of the Marine Corps, we did a pilot together. Didn't sell, but we played husband and wife. And as Larry was just telling you, Larry and I were both at the wonderful services at Janet's home just recently. And they showed a 1937 screen test with Janet Waldo. She died when she was 96.
Pristine condition. It was in pristine condition, and she was 18?
Yeah, 18. And in those days, with the screen test, the director is behind the camera, and he says, now, turn your head here, now say this, now let us know your name, now how old are you, and all these questions, you know. And she just stood there. It wasn't like she was answering. She was on stage. She was doing a performance. She was absolutely perfect when she was answering those questions. And she looked absolutely gorgeous. And I've always said to myself after seeing that, why wasn't Janet Waldo a major movie star? She didn't want to be behind the camera. She
hated being on film.
Yeah. And that's why she went in behind and on radio and doing character roles and voiceovers and everything.
I want to steal 1 minute of your time about, I have a story about Janet Walters very quick. She did some B westerns, the old budget series westerns, and she did one with an actor named Tim Holt, who was very popular in the 40s and 50s. I got a hold of that western, and I'm watching it, I'm waiting for Janet to show up, and off camera comes a parasol that hits the hero on top of the head, and then this deep voice just chastises him. Camera pulls back, it's Janet, but in this deep voice. So I immediately got on the phone and I called her. I said, I'm watching Law of the Bandit, and did they dub somebody in for you? She says, oh no, that was in my Katharine Hepburn phase. Anyway, another question.
I'm going to say one last question, and then, ladies and gentlemen, since we end at 4 and we have a giant windstorm that is supposed to come and knock us all to pieces, let's wrap this up.
Hi. I was just curious, when you got into animation, how similar was that to radio shows, or is there a difference?
Well, I did 2 major shows, The Funky Phantom and Jabberjaws for Hanna-Barbera, and that was a lot of fun. And I did, even before that, I did voiceovers for Filmation, Superman, and 3 or 4 other shows. And I was called in once to we just read the lines, we just did it. We didn't have to sync it, you know, with the pictures on the screen. But I was called in to do voiceovers, the lead voiceovers, for a series of Japanese animations. And I had to sync, I had to watch that character on the screen and sync my voice to that character whose mouth is going. That was a little difficult.
Well, I think what he was wanting to know is when you went into the studio, were you with the full cast, or did they just record your lines?
No, the full cast was there, and we did it just like a radio show. But I remember Joe Barbera, who loved to be an actor, came out and he tried to read some of the actors' lines and stuff to give them different inflections. Can you imagine, to the best radio actors in the world? But he loved to do that.
Well, fantastic. Can everybody please give Tommy a great big